Okay, all right. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you here with us tonight. We are here for another 411 meeting. If you haven't joined us before, we started these during the pandemic last spring, and we wanted to try to connect a lot of schools together because everybody was feeling really isolated when it all started and trying to figure out how to build community, but also how to support their own schools and have the information they need to do that. And so we've just kept them going and trying to provide information, especially for you all to be effective advocates and all of that. So my name is Michelle Parker. I'm the VP of Legislation with the District PTA. And we did a session, I guess, about a month ago with SFUSD on starting to learn to understand the SFUSD budget. And this is part 2 of that. And we might do another one after that as we help you all understand the budget better. And so we have with us tonight Megan Wallace, who is the Chief Financial Officer for SFUSD. We also have Anne Marie Gordon, who is the Budget Director, right? Is that her title? Right? I forget it all the time. Anne Marie, I'm so sorry. Budget Director, and then also we have Myung Lee with us, who's the Deputy Superintendent of Policy and Operations. So welcome, and thank you all for taking time on always these really busy weeks that you have and at night when your workday is already over. So thanks so much for being here. I am going to turn it over to you. We'll have you do your presentation, and then I will ask questions, a few that I have and that were pre-submitted. And then as you all have questions throughout the session, please go ahead and just put them in the chat and we'll get to whatever we can. And then that'll be it. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, Megan.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, get into presentation mode. So hi, everybody. Good evening. I will say that Myung, Anne Marie, and I all love just having a community of people who are interested in talking about these topics with us. So it's a joy to be here, and thank you so much. So I'm just gonna, well, we actually thought we'd kick it off with a little bit of a connector. Anne Marie, do you want to go ahead and lead on that?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Excited to be here for Budget 201. So this, I think we did this connector last time, I can't remember for sure, but good way to kind of see who's in the room, see who's here, and what different kind of parts of our SFUSD community people represent. So the way it'll work is that everyone will turn their cameras off, and then we'll say cameras on if you're an elementary school parent, for example, and then you turn your camera on if it applies to you so that we see, right, these different pockets of our community who are here tonight. So let's go ahead and have everybody turn their cameras off. And we will start with the one that I just said, which is cameras on if you are an elementary school parent or a representative of our elementary schoolers. Awesome. So then we'll go cameras off. And now let's see who's here for middle school. Hi, Melissa. So cameras off. I also don't want, I would be remiss if I did not say cameras on for anyone with K-8. Okay, maybe you already got elementary or middle. So then we'll do cameras on for high school. There we go. Cameras off. Cameras on if you're a member of your school's school site council or your child's school site council. Hi again, Melissa. Cameras off. And then our last one, we'll do cameras on if you are excited to be here tonight. Awesome.
Oh, that's a good one.
Thank you all. Okay. Hopefully it means we got everybody's cameras back on as we get started with our next few slides.
Thanks, Anne Marie. All right, so in the 101, we were really high level. What is the district's budget? You know, generally how, you know, what are its components? But here we wanted to take another step forward and really just take a pulse check of how is our budget doing? What is the financial outlook? And what is the district doing to align our budget to available sources while investing in our top priorities to improve student outcomes? So hopefully we'll cover all of those well tonight. So first, diving in on our budget. For anyone who actually isn't super familiar with the district's budget process, I just want to take a look back at this year and point out that we first adopted our budget on July 1st of 2020. It is a requirement for all school districts to submit a balanced adopted budget to the California Department of Education. We actually had a few things going on at that point in time. We were looking at potential funding coming from the federal level down through the state. And we were making some guesses at the time that we adopted our budget. But once we had a better set of information, particularly that we were in a position to receive learning loss mitigation funding from the state, it was mostly comprised of federal funds, but we were able to build that assumption into our budget. So we had an increase in our revenue, and then we also paired it with an increase of expenditures. We had adopted a budget with a really big savings assumption that we were going to have to work with labor to negotiate savings. And in our recertified budget that we submitted in August, we were able to take those out and have really just over a $10 million reserve available for this very unusual year of distance learning and unique costs around related to COVID-19 needs. So that's this very unusual year, but also with any other year, we are required to provide the state with 2 interim reports. They're midway checks for us to share with the state, you know, what adjustments are we making in our budget just based on current year trends, what are our actual and projected revenues and expenditures, and also showing some important checkpoints such as that we're maintaining our 2% operating reserve. So I've provided links to those presentations for anybody who wants to take a deeper dive on what we shared at those points in time. I do want to point out, though, that in both of those reports, we certified ourselves as qualified. A district can either be positive, qualified, or negative. I'm actually going to share a little bit about that. But because we're qualified, we actually are going to have to provide a year-end projection as well to the state. It's a less formal report. It's just a check-in to let them know that we're doing okay. Oh, and I'm sorry, actually, I didn't provide that detail as much. That basically the qualified is saying that we may or may not meet our fiscal obligations for the year. And really because, as you'll see, our multi-year projections are showing significant deficits, we had to certify ourselves as qualified because, as you'll see, we have some work to do as a district to right-size our ship, so to speak, make sure that we are creating a sound fiscal future for ourselves. So in terms of just giving a snapshot of how we're doing as a district, the answer is that we're doing okay. We have seen some shifts in our revenues. So you'll see in the UGF revenue line that overall we're seeing a change or reduction of $9.3 million, that we have seen ongoing losses in our revenues due to the local recession. Sales tax in particular is an area where we've seen declines. But we also ended up refining our state revenue projections as we were looking more closely at assumptions that were built into, around the budget for particular funding streams per pupil. We found that we needed to refine our state revenue projections. And It's not because the per pupil, that we weren't adapting to changes in our enrollment or average daily attendance. It was that we actually had to just improve our budget calculations. And so we made those corrections. But overall, our revenues have declined this year compared to that adopted budget. And then additionally, looking at our operating expenses, fortunately, because we have had our doors closed, the one upside of it is that we've actually seen savings in some areas. And so we've had operating savings that have offset that loss in revenue. And then additionally, we've been spending down that CARES reserve, or we call it the CARES reserve, that we've set aside $10.5 million at the beginning of the year, knowing that we would have expenses related to distance learning and general health and safety investments, like buying personal and protective equipment. And we've actually been spending some of that balance down. So you can see in this table in the green under the second interim, at the very bottom, there's a COVID-19 reserve that had started at 10.5, and then as of the second interim report, we've been anticipating we have $4.3 million left. Since that time, we've been opening our doors. We've seen a good number of our elementary sites opening. We're having more of our sites and students opening up and returning. And so we are spending those funds down. The good news is that the federal government did pass actually 2 more federal stimulus bills. And as you may be familiar with, ESER 2 was the second one. It was passed back in December. And we are going to be receiving about $43 million of those funds. And it's actually available to us this school year. So to the extent that we have expenses that exceed that $4.3 million reserve, we will be able to tap into those ESER funds. And so mentioning again about that 4.3, just some of the specific things that are actually coming as a new expense just since the second interim report. It is the COVID-19 surveillance testing and cleaning and disinfection of our sites. And I think the other point that I should just highlight is that the governor and legislature had announced new funding streams as well as the federal stimulus funds. The in-person instruction grant and the extended learning grant have arisen as additional funding streams that will be able to support our operations. So that's just a quick snapshot on how our budget is doing. I think the key takeaway is that we are doing all right. We have funds to fall back on to help us get through the year. But definitely the big story that you may be more familiar with is just the overall financial outlook of our district. And so with that, I want to go ahead and give you a little bit more of a backdrop of the budget trends looking backwards as well as forward. And I think before diving in too much, I want to orient you around this chart a little bit. That you can see that it looks back to 2018. We have actuals through fiscal year 17-18 to fiscal year 2019-20. Then we have our current year budget and then our projections. And the blue line represents our revenues. And the red line represents revenues and fund balance. So you can see that historically, we actually had substantial fund balance supporting our operations. And it was enough to cover expenditures in the yellow line. But as we've progressed over the years, we've drawn down those reserves. And over these last couple of years, we've been really working around the edges. So we've had very little wiggle room to accommodate changes that we have had to look for mid-year savings and looking for budget balancing solutions for this current year to help make sure that we have a balanced budget and have that required operating reserve. But looking ahead to fiscal year 21-22, and for 22-23, we've seen these very significant deficits of 100.2 million in the first year and 112.1 in the second year. And that growth is really largely a combination of expenses growing significantly, just the growth of personnel, assuming cost of living adjustments for non-personnel expenses as well, and then paired with the loss of one-time sources, such as we're very fortunate to receive $15 million this year from the city and county, but that's just a one-time funding stream. So just the combination of stagnant revenues and dramatic increases in our expenses is contributing to this major imbalance in our look ahead. The good news is that then we are receiving these ESSER funds, one-time funding source of 43 million. And then of course, the American Rescue Plan is really the thing that changed the overall story, at least for fiscal year 21-22. And so what this change in the chart depicts is a reduction in our expenditures. This chart really represents our unrestricted general fund, and the federal funds coming in will actually be categorized as restricted. So the reason why you see the expenditures decline is those expenses are moving off of the unrestricted and onto those restricted sources. So it feels like a relief in expenses for our budget in that year. A couple things going on there, though, with the American Rescue Plan funds. We are required to set aside 20% for learning recovery investments, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in just a little bit. But the reality is that this is just a short-term remedy. We can appreciate the relief that these funds will give us in this next year, but we are, as you can see, still facing this dramatic deficit, at least in that second year. So really, the difference between those charts before, when we were facing a $100 million deficit for 21-22, it meant that we were full steam ahead on a zero-based budgeting effort, really trying to get our heads around how do we realign our budget in that first year, and thinking about layoffs at a time when we're wanting to bring our kids back to schools and create stability for our students and our school sites. Like, how do you create that positive environment while taking dramatic cuts to your budget, which means reductions in services to our students? So really, the American Rescue Plan is allowing for our current approach of working for stabilizing our students and school sites, no formal reduction for budget reduction targets or layoffs, and then really forcing that process, pushing that process forward for 22-23. And we are looking to formalize a balancing plan by this coming December. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Myung.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Megan. Just checking if my audio is okay. Any issues there? Okay, awesome. So great to be with everyone tonight. Thank you for coming back. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join for the Intro 101 session last month, and I'm excited to be here. I'm going to cover 3 slides in this presentation, and the first 2 of them are going to be focused on the learning recovery resources that Megan mentioned. And they're a combination of state and federal dollars. And can't overstate the point that Megan just made about the impact of this American Rescue Plan that was signed in March, enacted in March. And that was the third major federal stimulus relief package, coronavirus relief package. And as Megan mentioned in the previous slide, the district is set to receive about $96 million of funds in total from that piece of legislation. And 20%, just restating, 20% of that amount is earmarked or dedicated to learning recovery. So that's that $19 million that's in the upper left-hand corner. And those funds have a fairly long shelf life. They can be spent until September of 2024. So over the course of the next several years. And you can see the types of investments that can be made in that list where it says purpose of funds. So reaching across the multiple domains of needs and strategies that we want to be able to be thoughtful about. So this includes academic supports, social emotional supports, professional learning, not stated on here, but important is technology. Oh, it does say technology. So wraparound services, a lot of flexibility in these permitted uses. And then here in California, we also have another even more significant set of resources devoted to learning opportunities. This is called the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, ELO or ELOG. I'm not sure exactly what acronym is gonna take root, but that's even larger. That these are resources that were approved, I think also in March, by the state legislature and signed by Governor Newsom. And these have to be spent faster, and it's a more significant total amount of funding. So in our case here in SFUSD, it's about $39 million, and the same types of parameters essentially as the American Rescue Plan dollars for learning recovery. So that's about $58 million in total. This is really, really important for us. I think true to the title of both of these sources of funds, it really is intended to accelerate learning for our students, social emotional supports, and really provides the level of resources that we think suits the level of need that our students have. So there is a fairly tight timeline to at least get a plan submitted to the California Department of Education. So you see right in the middle of that page, June 1st is coming up. There's a pretty high level template that districts have to submit, and our process is fast approaching. We want to share with our board's Budget and Business Services Committee a high-level draft of our thinking so far for those state dollars, and then on May 25th, the Board of Ed would review and hopefully approve the plan. And we know that it's going to be subject to modification and evolution after that, but we do need to meet the statutory deadline to get a plan, at least a preliminary plan, filed at CDE. Oh, and sorry, before we transition, I also want to say that we do want to, with all resources, but especially given the specific and unique context that we're in now, be thoughtful about investments that address needs and are rooted in evidence and data, and to monitor the outcomes, both baseline outcomes and the outcomes that we hope to see with these investments. Then the next slide, this in part restates some of what was on the previous slide, at least the right-hand portion of this of this slide. This is the same $39 million, so some of this is repetitive, but also did want to mention, and we know there's a fair amount of attention to this in our community and with our board as well. One of the other pieces of funding that was in that same piece of legislation, it was Assembly Bill 86 that was passed in March, is this in-person instruction incentive grant. And this is, to be honest with everyone here, we are not yet sure whether we're going to qualify for these funds or not. And that's, we will know, we will have to know fairly soon. But the biggest condition that we are not quite sure of is there's a requirement that in-person learning be offered to all the students in a single secondary grade, grades 6 through 12 in our case. And we could go into that in the Q&A if folks want to, focus on that. But in the meantime, we are aware that there is some funding on the table, that if we can meet those conditions, that we could stand to get, the maximum would have been close to $18 million. There is a sliding scale based on timing of when that in-person learning would be offered. And so we are into that period where the funding that we could qualify for is less than that now. Okay, so I think I've got one more slide, and let me just, there are a lot of numbers on here and really too many to give fair due treatment in the time we have, but did want to just illustrate, and maybe we can go into some of this in questions and the Q&A time as well. But as I think you could probably tell, there are so many different variables, both in terms of revenues and expenditures that we and districts across the state and across the country are really trying to navigate. And that really calls for scenario planning. So in order to manage the magnitude of potential budget shortfalls that we need to cure, as well as the multiple funding sources and the needs that our students have, we're planning a number of different scenarios for the rest of this year, next year, and in the future, especially with an eye towards the year after next, FY 22-23. So in each of these scenarios, these are high-level scenarios, we all begin with an assumption that we've had, a set of assumptions that we've had for a few months about projected deficits of 100 million in the upcoming year, 21-22, and 112 million in the following year, 22-23. That's what we thought we were facing a few months ago. But then we all were very happy to see and relieved to see the stimulus, the federal stimulus dollars in particular, ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, and that's in the sort of top section of the chart here. And those dollars, they're fairly flexible. They total almost $120 million, and so that really helps us a great deal and allows us, as Megan said, to have a bit more time to really confront the structural deficit that we're all very concerned about. And then from that point on, we have different strategies for managing our operating budgets, the learning and recovery dollars, and health and safety investments, especially connected to COVID and return to in-person learning. And these days, the team here is most focused on the right-hand set of columns called the better scenario. And Megan's gonna, I think it's Megan, that's gonna go into this in a little bit more detail, but that basically represents the path that we see towards reserving enough funds to help us balance in that year after next, FY 22-23. And we're working, this team is working together really closely every day and with colleagues and the superintendent. And also this is a focal topic and a running topic of interest of the board, especially our Budget and Business Services Committee. And really it's evaluating trade-offs to one way or the other to balance our budget, to get out of this qualified fiscal status and back into a positive fiscal status. And that is our, from a fiscal perspective, that is our North Star. So let me turn it, Megan, I think, is it you that's gonna talk about the path?
You're muted, Megan. Yeah.
She's still muted.
Sorry, too many bars hanging down or blocking my unmute. My apologies. Yes, I'm going to kick off the path forward. So I think, you know, the mantra we've been sharing is with the federal stimulus funds, we're going to stabilize our students and our school sites, but we're entering our path towards fiscal sustainability. So this is here we're going to go into some details about our strategies for getting on that right course. So I think first of all, I just want to highlight some of those key strategies, and then I'm actually going to hand it over to Anne Marie, and she's going to dive in a bit on zero-based budgeting. You know, and so the first step is balancing our budget using the federal and state funds, you know, as a one-time opportunity to maintain our staff and our services for our students during this time of transition. And then, you know, I think it is important to note that the American Rescue Plan is intended to stabilize people in the workplace, keep people working. So I think those things complement one another. But we are looking to formalize a balancing plan for fiscal year 22-23, and we have to look at those outer years as well, because as long as we want to get into a positive certification, we need to be able to show the California Department of Education that our multi-year projections are also looking to be balanced. So I see that as being two parts. That one, the zero-based budgeting is looking at our investments. What are the expenditures? Do we understand what we're spending our money on and why? Are we prioritizing it? Do we understand what is core to having a school district open versus supporting specific priorities? But then, of course, looking at our revenue streams. We need to stabilize and secure both ongoing and one-time sources. They both serve important purposes. And I think one of the key ones that many of us are looking at is enrollment. We've talked a little bit as a district about the fact that we have seen over 1,000 students leave the district in the current school year. We're hoping to see them come back next year, and in October we'll have a much better sense of really where we're landing in terms of overall enrollment and average daily attendance. But if we lose ground there, we're losing ground on a critical ongoing funding stream for our district. So we need to think about and work hard to bring those students back. And then it's important to highlight the RISE initiative that the city and school district are working together to look at bringing in additional funding for school district needs. But I'd be remiss to leave out our need to rebuild our reserves and address our long-term liabilities. Just last night, I presented to the board our annual audit report where those were highlighted. So we need to keep an eye out for one-time sources and thinking about how we want to build in setting aside funds for these things within our budget process as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Anne Marie.
Thanks, Megan. I have a couple of slides here. I am going to try to keep it fairly brief to give us as much time for Q&A as possible. But the next couple of slides are a little bit more information about zero-based budgeting, both our vision for what the process is going to be over the next several years, and then a little bit more about what we've embarked upon this year and learned so far with the first kind of few months of taking on what is really a different approach, a different mentality around how we build our budget each year. And so what you see here is what our previous practice and what is really a common practice for school districts, for kind of, public entities is an incremental budgeting approach. And what we really identified with this looming deficit, with the need to really have clarity around how to address our deficit and have a sustainable budget, that was what brought us to zero-based budgeting in the first place. And the idea is that with zero-based budgeting, you start from zero. You start from the ground and build your budget upwards, thinking about what core functions are required to run a school district, to run a school, and then build from there based on priorities. And then right from there, where we're lucky, looking at enhancements of our services to support students. And so that's what we're working towards. And really where we are now is being able to build a budget that, as you can see at the kind of bottom center of this slide, is balanced, sustainable, and reflects our priorities, and making sure that we can clearly articulate our priorities through our budget. And then over time, what we want is to then build kind of the evaluation, reflection, right? Really lean on the cycles of continuous improvement that we use as a district to then identify the strategies that are working most effectively, right? Be able to evaluate what we do to make sure that we're continuing to prioritize the services that have the greatest impact, right? And are really supporting our students in the way that we feel is most important. And you may see my cat, just excuse him. He's taking a little bit of a walk. Next slide, please, Megan. So this, with this process of zero-based budgeting, what it does is it shifts the way that we articulate what our budget is comprised of. On the left, you can see, and I know there was a calculation error, I think, in our last presentation of this information. It has since been corrected, but you can see, this is one particular way to look at a large portion of our budget, the majority of our unrestricted general fund. And so the idea is shifting that to something where you're looking at base package, right, identifying those core functions, and then from there adding on priorities, and building service enhancements on top. Next slide, please. So then here we have really where we stand after our first few months of going through a zero-based approach to evaluating kind of, organizing our budget. It's really helpful and it's really challenging to do zero-based budgeting. It's really reinvigorating to go back to kind of square one and reflect on why we do what we do. But it's very time intensive. It is very tedious. That was one of the things we knew going in, is that it's a very work intensive process to essentially reconstruct a budget under kind of a different perspective. So I think that's really, of all the takeaways, that was one of the really big ones, but it's really helped us think about how to be thoughtful and efficient with how we move forward over the next 8 or 9 months. And then I'll go ahead, we can move to the next slide. Speaking of those 8 or 9 months, which is really our timeline and milestones between now and the end of 2021. Up top is the focus on planning for this upcoming school year, 21-22. And then along the bottom is the timeline for then looking beyond 22-23. And so it's kind of a little bit of both, having to balance both. We're having kind of parallel conversations. You can see that right now we are really in the weeds of preparing for next year. The additional learning recovery funding and the fact that we have to create some new plans does does add a little bit of work to our plates to make sure that the picture for next year is clear and that we've really thought through how we're using all of those funds. And then once we're in a good spot there, we'll be shifting gears to planning so that we have a balancing plan ready by December of this year. So the one final note here you'll see in the 21-22 planning is that it mentions both the proposed budget and the LCAP. The LCAP is the Local Control and Accountability Plan, which is a 3-year plan that we submit to the California Department of Education that is a reflection of our goals, our actions, and how our expenditures are aligned to those in order to achieve our desired outcomes for students. So that will be making its way through and be available publicly in the coming months. So just keep an eye out for that. But that's, I think, one important component that with COVID, our typical requirements were put on hold. So we haven't seen an LCAP in a while, but it'll be coming back around by the beginning of June. So with that, I think we are done with the presentation. So we can shift gears for questions.
Great. Thank you all for that information. I have many questions, and I know that there were some that were submitted ahead of time. And actually, before I keep going, I'm going to put a link in the chat that is to a feedback form. So one thing I'd like all of you, the people who are attending, to be thinking about as we keep going through the rest of this meeting is, what else do you want to know more about? So if we do another one of these sessions, where do we need to dive deeper, greater understanding? Because clearly the financial outlook of our district is complex, and we're looking at a lot of these next few years and spend a lot of time on that, and not quite as much on the aligning district resources with the priorities for student impact, and really talking about that in more depth. And I know some people have had questions about, for instance, when we're applying the weighted student formula at a school, what does that actually look like? So that practical application of some of these concepts and ways that you are using the finances at the district level, what does that actually mean at a school site? And so everybody, so you can put some notes about what else you'd like to see in that feedback form, or just also put it in the chat, because then the staff who are here can also see that those are questions that you're having. And so we can capture them that way too. Okay, so the people can keep putting some questions in the chat, and I saw that Myung started to answer some. So those of you, Myung and Megan and Anne Marie, if there's anything you see that's easy to answer in the chat, go ahead while we're talking about some of this. Okay, couple of the questions that I wanted to bring up first were, let's see, actually, I'll go to the, where to even start first. Actually, maybe some clarification on the slides that Myung, that you were sharing. And we were talking about, making these data-informed, taking these data-informed approaches on how to spend the funds. And, so there's one related question to that, which is, how are you determining exactly where you will have the most impact beyond just using a data-informed approach? So are you, is the LCAP, the LCAP task force and the LCAP input process that we already have in place, will that be the primary way that, although for this, if you have the deadline June 1st to be able to put a plan together, I'm just wondering how teachers and parents' input might be used in that, or how school sites through their SFUSD process, at the school site councils, just things like that. How are our school communities going to be involved in determining what are the best ways to spend these one-time funds? And then I also wanted to note that in the better column, next year, it still is a negative $71 million. And so if there's any initial thinking you all can share about what are we going to do with that, that would be awesome. So those are two different questions, but maybe we could start with those, and then I will take a look at what questions are coming in the chat. And then I have a couple that have been coming up a lot over time that I'll ask also. we'll just squeeze everything in that we can.
Great. So maybe we could tag team, Anne Marie and Megan, on the question about data and the needs assessment. So yeah, super complex. And the good thing is we have multiple inputs, if you will. We have no shortage of sources to turn to get some insights. So one thing that I might mention is, and you did too, Michelle, is the accumulation of data that we've gathered through multiple years, frankly, of the LCAP process and the stakeholder engagement that the LCAP task force has undertaken and led. The input from our multiple advisory committees, and we're also, we have an eye towards resolutions that the Board of Ed has passed as well. So, those are some of the shovel-ready sources that we already have, and we are combing through to harvest. I mean, we can't reach every need, obviously, even based on those inputs, even with a pretty significant infusion of one-time dollars. But we do have a lot of information that we've collected as a community and as a system, and then there's some additional emerging work that we're really excited to tap into from organizations that are really trying to advise districts across the state about using evidence-based practices. So maybe I'll stop there. I don't want to. I'd love it if Anne Marie or Megan wanted to chime in on either of those aspects too.
I would say just briefly add that on the evidence-based practices aspect of it, we actually we've been working with our research planning and assessment with members of that team to look at some of the research that is being done around kind of effective uses and frameworks to look at how to organize investments for learning recovery. So I know that's one thing that's been, we've kind of just kicked off conversations with, again, it's a very short time frame to kind of learn of the requirements and then develop a plan. And then we're also looking at then partnering with leaders, like our instructional leaders, because their experience supporting schools, right, kind of understanding student needs. We're going to be, I think, kind of blessed and cursed by the fact that it is the template itself is fairly high level. There's just, I think, 7 or so categories where we indicate how much we're planning to spend in each. But I do think that we won't feel comfortable, right, putting that plan forward, putting that template forward without understanding the details more deeply than what the template will require. So I think that's a little bit of, at least for the planning process, finding that balance between feeling like we've really gotten far enough in the process and really can lean on what we've done so far. But as Myung said, there is going to be the opportunity to iterate and update as we finalize things for next year.
Thank you. All right, I'm sure we can talk for a long time about each one of these questions, but here's one that's coming up a lot. I think Courtney captures it here, is what is the basic question, are we allowed to operate at a deficit? So what happens if we start a year and we really are at 71 under? What happens? People have been asking about what not in these chats, but a lot of people have asked in the past is what puts us into state receivership? When we're looking at the interim reports and kind of our qualifications, what triggers that? Can one of you speak to that?
I can speak to that. So I think the answer is no, you can't operate at that deficit. You could build in balancing measures, so reducing expenses or possibly asking the city to pitch in, right? You've either got to reduce your expenses or increase your revenues, one way or another. And if you do that, if you don't do that, and you are operating at a deficit, really that's and you don't have any other solutions, you are basically saying you're going negative in your certification. So I was just thinking that the rainy day reserve is typically where we would turn to, but unfortunately have drawn those down. And so all the more reason why we really do need to find a good balance of a reserve to have in place, because sometimes you hit those bumps and you don't anticipate them. If you've got a pandemic, for example. So I think, yeah, I guess that's about all I have to say. Myung or Emery, do you have anything to add? Complement that?
Maybe just this is another complicated topic, but the state applies a range of possible interventions. So it depends on the magnitude of the distress that they detect through things like these interim reports, and they start off more moderate, I guess, and then the other end of that spectrum is I think, as Courtney alluded to, there are more drastic steps, more muscular interventions, including assumption of some of the responsibilities that the governing board, the local governing board, would otherwise maintain. And so there's a whole suite of steps, and they do start on kind of the shallow end of the pool and they get more serious depending on the degree of problems that they diagnose.
Thank you. I'm sure you all are seeing some of the questions come in here, but this may get too in the weeds, and I want to ask this question about our county and our district expenses now, but I want to flag, Megan, that Beth has a question here about trans that I know we just recently talked about in budget meetings, and so you might be able to answer that in the chat. Okay, so there are frequently questions that come up in our district from parents, but not just from parents, from a lot of people trying to understand our county budget and our district budget and how those interact. And when we're trying to compare, because we are so unique in San Francisco that we are a county office and a district and a city and a county, all those things in one thing. And so when we're trying to look at how we are spending funds, what is really allocated to the county and the district, how do those interact when we're trying to compare ourselves against other school districts and how they are spending, particularly on the amount of funds going to instruction versus instructional support services, those kinds of things. Can you help us pull apart that web a little bit so people understand how to compare apples to apples? What does it mean to be a county office? What expenses are associated with that, as opposed to just a school district?
Yeah, so, right, so the county office functions that we carry include special education is probably one of the largest. Typically you would, if we were a standalone county office, maybe we would have our own operating, regular office operations that actually are carried in the district instead. But in our case, we fund things like special education, like transportation, and those are actually the larger ones that we do carry in the county fund. And so the interaction is that to the extent that we aren't able to cover our county operation costs just within that county fund with unique funding sources, the county fund receives its own subset of local control formula funding. We receive grants related to supporting special education and other services, but those revenue streams are not sufficient enough to cover operations. So we actually contribute unrestricted general fund from the district office to the county. And some of the biggest line items you'll see in our budget actually include transfers from the district to the county. And so I think in that way, we are unique in having that support. If we were just a county office and we were, didn't have a district to support our operations, I wonder if some of our narrative would be different if we had to find ways to balance without those district dollars.
So if
anyone else have anything to add? Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I was going to say, I can also just briefly add, I think one of the other primary county functions is our kind of county alternative schools. I think that's one of the other main, the main things that if you were to look at, right, our like county fund that you would see in the budget are kind of our, we have kind of our the juvenile schools, county community, county opportunity, just a couple of different alternative school sites and alternative programs that are, they are small in comparison to many of our district schools, but I think that's one of the other kind of unique functions of a county. But then I know that I feel like there is in many ways, because we are one kind of, we say district staff, you do end up, I think, in certain cases with a little bit of commingling where that apples to apples is hard, because since we I would say that since we serve both purposes, right? We submit an LCAP for a district and a county simultaneously. There are times where I think it can even be a little bit challenging to draw out that apples to apples comparison, because our superintendent is the superintendent of, right, the county and the district. Like, you have a little bit of overlap there, where if you were to look at Alameda, there would be a different kind of, there would be more differentiation of certain roles and responsibilities.
So if we have, the expenses you all are talking about, special education, transportation, county schools, things like that on the county office books, and if the revenue the county has is inadequate to cover those expenses and we are contributing, what happens in districts like Santa Clara, for instance, who may have districts, who has a county office and they have certain obligations, similar obligations, yes. How does that interaction work? So how are the ways you can compare the functionality of a Santa Clara office as opposed to San Francisco office, the county office, and the districts that that they support?
I'll chime in on this. My understanding, this is a bit complicated, but I'll try to offer one important distinction, is that in most districts, special education costs are accounted for directly within their district's books. And for a long time, we've had a practice of, and this predates me, I've been with this district a long time, but this has been true for even longer, that for whatever reasons, we historically had recorded the costs of special education, including the teachers, the paraeducators, all of the staff, as well as non-public schools and special ed transportation costs, as costs within our county, associated with our county, and because the specific revenues that we and every other district in the country receive for special education are not sufficient to cover all those costs, there is a gap between revenues and expenses, and the way we've historically accounted for all of this takes the form of a contribution from the district to the county, and the expenses are paid for through the county. It's I think led to an inadvertent skewing of the way that the statistics show up for the district's expenses. So there's a huge category of expenses that's called other outgo, which is largely made up of this contribution to cover the shortfall in special education. But in a district, like to your question or your example, Michelle, say San Jose Unified, that they would pay for their special education staff and paraeducators, and many of the staff that we pay for, or we have paid for through our county, they would pay for it through their district per se. And so this is something that we've kind of gotten a better sense of over the past several years in particular, and we're trying to kind of tease this back so we are our approach is more similar to a typical district, and it's a bit of a work in progress. We're making some headway there, and I think it's still a little bit distorted, to be honest, but that's the biggest single factor.
Thank you. I think, many of us, I'll call us budget curious folks, who may not be financial experts, but who can, work our way around a budget. We'll go somewhere like eddata.org, which if you all don't know of that website, it's just ed-data.org. It's a good place to go, just check out data on a bunch of school districts and compare. And it's hard to go there and just kind of compare SF Unified against other ones and see where we fit on where we're spending our funds. And, and do you have, is there any advice navigating those sites, or is it just understanding that it's hard to compare them because we're just so unique, and we just need to know that and then find other ways to evaluate whether the concentrations on, funds and resources that are directly supporting students as opposed to being in somewhere else in administrative costs or whatever. Yeah, there, Beth just put the put the bookmark. So do you have advice on what, those of us who are trying to navigate those things on our own?
I think this would be we have focused a fair amount, especially in the last year, I would say, the three of us, Megan and Anne Marie and I, on this exact set of questions, the statistics that are shown in ed data, looking at how our data show up versus other districts. We might be able to send some information out in an email. It's a little bit, it would be great to be able to navigate and kind of, click through some screen shares of some stats that we've compiled, and that would be a great, what is it, 202?
Yeah, or 301
session,
or whatever.
301. Yeah,
Yeah.
the advanced seminar.
Right.
But it's actually, we are, I don't want to say intrigued, but this is something, we had a meeting about this today, in fact, with one of our commissioners. So it's on our minds, and we are familiar with the data. We'd love a chance to share, answers to some of these questions with anybody who wants to follow up.
That would be great. I hear these questions a lot, and I hear a lot of people trying, just it's hard, it's hard to really understand where things are. And so I think it would be great to have more about that. The other thing I'd like to flag as a topic, perhaps for a 301, is when we talk about the long-term fiscal health of our district, but not even just ours, all of the districts across the state, we can't help but talk also about pension liabilities and things like that. And while a lot of that happens at the state level, I think a lot of people have questions about how that even works. And so perhaps that's a topic to add to another session, to help people understand the function of that at the state. So I have that, and I know we're over time here. And so let me see if there's a quick clarifying question that I had. Are you trying to say something, Megan? Your face just popped up on my screen. I didn't know if you had something you wanted to say. Maybe not. Okay, because we're almost out of time, can I ask Myung one more question of you, and then everybody keep adding your questions to the chat box, because I will have them saved, and I will gather them together, and we'll form what the next session could include. But the last clarifying question that I didn't get to really hear about, Myung, that maybe you could help with is around the LWEA funds, the Prop G funds. So we all know we passed a parcel tax in November, which is great. Now we're receiving funds to pay our teachers their salary, but there was that 2 years in between, right? From 2018 to 2020, 3 years. So we had a period of time where we were dipping down into our reserves. We were using funds from the city so that we could continue, so that we could pay our teachers their raises that were put in that, even though the Prop G was caught in litigation and still is. Do you have any updates on that? And do you want to give a very brief, let people know that those funds, what will happen if it gets out of litigation and the appeal doesn't go through and we get to have those funds back, how that will help our bottom line and our reserve situation? And maybe that could be our last point.
Sure. Yeah, it's a favorite topic of mine to be. I mean, I'm not kidding. It's like literally a favorite topic of mine.
Talked about it lots of times too, I know.
So yes, so Prop G was passed in June of 2018, and almost immediately challenged in court, and that case is still unresolved. So as Michelle said, there are 3 years, 3 fiscal years, 18, 19, 19, 20, and 2021, the year that we're in, during which the tax has been collected, by the treasurer tax collector, and it's to the tune of $50 million a year. And so they're sitting in escrow. There's a large amount of funds that are sitting in escrow, pending the resolution of this legal case. And I'm tempted to go into more detail than we have time for, so I'll just kind of buttonhole it and to say that as far as the status of the case, the city and county has received 1 favorable ruling at the trial court level. And there are oral arguments that are, about to be scheduled at the Court of Appeal, which is the 2nd level. And I'll just say that all the other challenges, there are 3 tax measures that have been challenged in a similar way on similar constitutional questions. And the city is batting 1,000 so far on those. And so, hopes are high, I'll say it that way, for the way this case will ultimately be resolved, but it's not settled yet. And it might take a while. It depends on whether the case ultimately gets appealed to the state Supreme Court. And if it does, then and the state Supreme Court decides to take it up, which it may or may not, but if it does, then that could take another couple of years to get resolved. So when that case gets resolved, if it's resolved in favor of the city and county, then that represents like really, really, really good news for us. And we definitely don't want to say, well, now we have $100+ million to find, things to spend it on, because that would frankly just be, continuing a trend that we want to interrupt, of relying on one-time dollars to plug holes in the deficit. So, we have, Megan especially has given a lot of great thought to how we can strategically utilize those funds to, to in some respects, alleviate our short-term needs, but, more broadly, help us on our path to a more stable, sustainable fiscal strategy or set of strategies. So, but that's a big pending question, and it could be resolved in months, and it could be resolved in a couple of years. But we are hopeful that it'll go the right way. Oh, and sorry, Michelle, you also mentioned, I left this out, the measure last November's measure, Prop J. The effect of that is it basically, starting next fiscal year, 21-22, and the following 16 years, it basically replaces Prop G, which is the subject of the litigation. So it basically, shores up the funding for the going forward, and leaving the questions unresolved about the first 3 years of the measure of Prop G.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we're already over, and we need to let everybody get back to their families and lives after a long day. But I think there's lots more questions we could answer. So again, just keep sending them in. You can, folks, you can send to me. I'm putting my email in the chat box if you want to send them directly to me too, if you don't want to put them in the forums. I have put a few links in the chat. One is for, there's a sign up form if you want to know about future 411 meetings, and you just kind of randomly get to know about them either through social or somebody happens to send them to you. Just sign up directly. Make sure you get them. I put up a sign up for next week. We're doing a 411 meeting called A Path to Equity. We have the principal at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, Michael Essien, coming to speak with us and talk to us about how we can change systems to improve outcomes for students and talk about the work they've been doing at their school. And it's pretty fantastic. I've heard him give the presentation before. And then I also put the feedback form for today's meeting where you can add other questions, give ideas, like tell us what worked, what didn't work, and give us ideas for future 411 meetings. Thank you all, Megan, Anne Marie, and Myung, for making time to be with us tonight. I know it's after a night of a long board meeting yesterday, and more tomorrow. I guess there's another meeting tomorrow. So thank you for taking the time to be with us and for sharing this information. Thank you everybody who made the time to be here to learn more about how the budget works. And it's helpful when you're here to learn these things, because then you're more effective advocates at your schools and for your kids and district-wide, when we can become more conversant in this kind of in the language and just how our finances work, because we know our budgets are a reflection of our priorities in our district. And so the more we understand them, the better we can help provide feedback to strengthen them. So thank you. And I think that's it for tonight. Hope everybody has a good rest of your week, and we hope you can join us next week. And for any future times, let us know how we can help and support you all. Okay. Good night.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.